Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of our ongoing series on law in time of crisis. And today we're joined by Professor Jodi Balsam, Associate Professor of Clinical Law and Director of our externship programs here at Brooklyn Law School. Jodi is a former in-house attorney at the NFL and teaches sports law at Brooklyn Law School. Welcome, Jodi. Maybe you can start us off by talking about the ways in which the pandemic has impacted baseball, which would currently be having its season, as well as basketball, which would be in the playoffs right now, and all of the other major sports.
The sports games themselves obviously are not an essential business and cannot be played at this stage in the pandemic. There are many adjacent businesses, such as fantasy leagues and now legal sports wagering, concessions, sponsorships, athletic gear, that are deeply impacted by the cessation of sports contests. And the sports leagues and players' unions and all of these entities are now struggling with how to manage the shutdown and plan to resume.
And are there legal issues that have already arisen in the context of sports not happening? We can talk in a minute about the legal issues that will arise as we contemplate resumption of sports, but are there legal concerns that have already revealed themselves in the context of the shutdown?
Yeah, absolutely. So, almost immediately there were reopened negotiations between the team sports, the leagues on the one hand, and their players' unions on the other hand. The shutdown raised all sorts of complicated issues involving what compensation would still be due to the players, how to revenue share a shrunken pie. In addition, fans and ticket holders almost immediately sought to learn the fate of their investments in their team, the tickets already paid for. How long would the suspension of games last? When will tickets be refunded? When will leagues and teams be willing to bill for upcoming seasons? Venue contracts, which all of a sudden had to become, mined for their force majeure and impossibility clauses. Led to all sorts of negotiations between the teams and the arenas in which they played in. Broadcasters, most were entitled to withhold royalty payments if games are not played, and that's the main source of revenue for most leagues. Game day staff, people whose income are entirely dependent on whether the games are played, are now lining up for whatever benefits are available for them under the CARES Act. Rookie drafts, which occur in the late spring in many leagues, were also sort of up in the air. Should they be conducted at all? How should teams calculate their draft strategy at a time when it's not sure the revenues are there to be able to invest in the best players? Major League Baseball, for example, delayed its amateur player draft to July and reduced it to only 5 rounds, which will, under the terms of their collective bargaining agreement, reduce the signing bonuses available. So there's going to be an entire generation of baseball players trying to enter the big show who will not have the salary rewards that they were anticipating.
Turning to the future then, when can I expect that there are going to be any sports on my television, and what are they going to look like when they do come back? Is there a general sense of what the arrangements will be like in order to deal with health and safety issues, as well as respond to some of the legal context?
Yeah, well, here's where I like to quote my favorite philosopher, Yogi Berra, who said, if people don't want to come out to the ballpark, nobody's going to stop them. And that's basically where we are right now. Even if governments loosen restrictions and allow sports to resume, and they may or may not do so with fans in the seats, but assume that governments say you're free to operate the way you did in normal times. Who's going to want to go to the ball games at this point? We all want our sports back, but we may prefer to see it sitting in our own living room. And the problem with sports in general, unlike many businesses, as I mentioned earlier, is it unavoidably requires participants to be in close contact, right? There's no social distancing. And it also involves a number of stakeholders, all of whom are essential for the entertainment product to be produced, including the leagues, the teams, the players, the venues, the networks, local governments that provide all sorts of municipal services on game day, the umpires. So the way it's going to resume is you're going to start with some kind of proposal from the league vetted by various medical experts. I happen to know that almost immediately upon the pandemic shutdown, every sports league started to retain consultants in the medical and infectious disease area. They all are well advised, and they will have to come forward with some sort of proposal. Here's how we should come back. The next step is getting the players to buy in and accommodating their concerns. And there's the two biggest stumbling blocks there are player compensation and player health. Despite the fact that most commissioners in the United States leagues have huge discretion to reestablish a season within public law constraints, obviously they can't do it without the players being willing to take the field. And the resumption will depend on state and local government restrictions on gathering and on the ability to implement and maintain health requirements, because you don't want to restart and then backpedal because of a second wave of infection. And just about every state, including even New York, which is a pandemic hotspot, just about every state is now making all the right noises. We want sports to come back. Please plan to resume. There will be limitations, but we want you back. But I think you'll find leagues making startup decisions based on which jurisdictions have the most relaxed restrictions on gatherings. And our system of federalism and the lack of unitary power to reopen the country nationwide means that different communities are entitled to prioritize their physical versus their economic health in contrasting ways. And every national business, including sports leagues, will have to deal with that.
I take it there are probably some features of the sports themselves or their natural timetable or schedule that would also affect when they come back or how they come back. I mean, you mentioned tennis earlier. That's a sport that one thinks about as not involving a lot of contact between rivals, and there aren't teammates, at least if you're playing singles. Golf maybe fits into that category as well. But other sports that are team sports have very different size rosters and different degrees of interaction and travel, and just happen at different times, whether it's summer or fall. Are there any that seem particularly likely or unlikely to come back soon or on their usual timeline?
Yeah, so let's talk about the four major team sports in the United States. Two of them, the NHL and the NBA, were close to the ends of their season when they had to suspend operations. And what they're thinking about at this point in time is salvaging as much as they can of the remainder of their season, which may just be playing their postseason playoff series, right? So they may not resume regular season games. And they're talking about centralizing their operations in a neutral location that has a lot of facilities like hotels and arenas. Orlando has been mentioned, Las Vegas has been mentioned, and concluding a series of playoff games to at least have a complete season under their belt. It'll involve all sorts of quarantining and social distance measures and testing. The biggest challenge is for a league like Major League Baseball, which has considered and discarded a bunch of options for starting a season that never got underway. It was shut down before it had a chance to start. The start date was March 26th. Not a game has been played this season. And it's illustrative of the difficulty of replicating the huge infrastructure required by a 30-team operation located all over the country, each with rosters of 25 plus coaches and trainers and umpires. They've considered a format that realigns the league into Florida and Arizona divisions based on where teams conduct spring training. What was known as the biodome concept. That's actually been replaced by a new proposal that envisions a shorter season where people play in their home stadiums without fans. They actually have issued a document for public vetting that is 67 pages long, solely addressing the player and game participant health and safety concerns of resumption. And it extends far beyond COVID-19. So for example, the onboarding process. Yes, there'll have to be quarantines. How long? How do you test this number of people? What if certain players refuse to return for family or other reasons? Then how do you get those players back in shape so that they start playing fit enough to avoid injury? How do you deal with the fact that some games, if they were centralized in a warm weather location, it might actually be too hot to play during the day? And how do you deal with the ordinary habits of Major League Baseball players? So this document says that there shall be no spitting, no use of sunflower seeds, no fist bumps, no patting on the back. I mean, it goes down into minutia of how players must conduct themselves during the game resumptions that I'm not sure it's possible to enforce.
Will there still be lingering effects? What do you expect will last from the way things realign or reorganize themselves during this pandemic that will become a new normal, even when sports return in something like their old selves?
Well, I would say that's very much dependent on the science and the medicine, whether there's a vaccine, whether there's reliable, quick, easy testing. We could be facing a multi-year situation where teams in some cities could host games, perhaps eventually with spectators, while teams in other cities might be legally barred from doing so. And the list of cities capable of hosting games could change depending on when and where outbreaks strike. You may have a patchwork result that makes the notion of a home game in sports impractical. As I said, you'll have all sorts of ticket holder screening with the concomitant privacy concerns. And revenue, of course, will be, revenue expectations will have to be adjusted, right? So gate receipts are no longer the primary driver of revenue for pro leagues. TV revenue is king, but ticket sales remain a considerable source of revenue that is shared by owners and players. I mean, in the NFL, with their huge TV deals, it's only 15% of total revenue, but that's still significant. And in the NHL and MLB, it's over 35% of revenue. And if you can't rely on gate receipts, how will that affect the salaries that you can pay? And the presence of spectators impacts other revenue streams related to sponsorships, signage, concessions, parking. Now, the leagues can operate without spectators, and I think most of us are so desperate for sports to return, we'll take what we could get on television. But the long-term impact will be sports franchises may be worth less for time being. Players may have to adjust their salary expectations. I mean, sports is a healing mechanism, as we've seen after 9/11, and everybody is very anxious to resume, but I don't think there's going to be a return to normal sports for potentially years.
Well, that's not the best prospect, but we'll take it whenever it can arrive. So we've been talking thus far primarily about professional sports leagues, but of course the world of sports also includes various amateur and other leagues, whether it's college sports, the NCAA, amateur athletics, youth athletics, the Olympics. Can you talk a little bit about the impact of what we're seeing in the world on all of those other aspects of the world of sport?
Well, most people already know this. The Olympics were postponed an entire year, and it's not certain that they will take place. The Tokyo Olympics will now be scheduled for next summer, 2021, instead of this summer. That has huge impact across the board on everybody involved in the games. Not just on a revenue basis. They are anticipating a $600 million loss from that delay, but the athletes themselves, athletes like Simone Biles, who was preparing for her final Olympic competition, who was talking about the strain and stress on her body over these years and how she was looking forward to a last burst of glory, which is now delayed an entire year. That's an elite athlete who has plenty of resources to be able to train consistently throughout the coming year and still be prepared for the games, the delayed games. But what about the ordinary athletes, the ones who are at the margins, who are struggling just to participate in the Olympics? What's going to happen to their training regimens and the support that they need to continue to compete? With the NCAA, well, they had to confront the same issues that all the professional leagues did back in March. They canceled all of their spring sports. They have a different range of issues, though, because the athletes in all those spring sports have now lost a year of their eligibility to play, and they're going to award them an extra year of eligibility. But that itself raises all sorts of issues for the colleges. How do you allocate scholarship dollars now that you have an extra cohort of athletes back on campus next spring? How do you allocate playing time? Will freshmen next year get a chance? Athletes preparing for a post-college career, including playing at the professional level, now don't have a chance to demonstrate those skills. It affects university budgets. And now that return to campus is uncertain for fall of 2020, what will it do to college football programs, which is a major issue for many universities, which rely heavily on that revenue stream to fund all sorts of programs beyond athletics. So it's been pretty devastating to the world of amateur sports, all the way down to youth soccer leagues. When will parents feel comfortable resuming those?
Thanks very much. Thanks to everyone for tuning in. Please come back again for the next conversation in our series on law in time of crisis.